I usually stick to what I'm good at in my bee talks, which is talking about myself, but that's easy to find these days on YouTube. So if you want to hear my story about how I got into bees, how I won 6 hives in a poker game, or things like that, you can just like find it online. I've never posted anything on there, but other people have for me. But I want to kind of pick up on where a lot of that talk has left off and talk about the way I've done things in the last couple years as my queen business. I produce around 3,000 queens a year, all from treatment-free survivor stock from here in New York. And so I always run out of time by the end of telling my own story that I never really get to, like the heart of what I'm doing now and what I see as the future of beekeeping and where this is all going and how we can all be a part of it. So this is usually like the last slide, the last couple of slides that I show at my talk, showing one of my favorite bee customers over in Connecticut. Her name's Sarah. This was her first little package that I got for her going into her top bar hive, and she has these awesome boots, and she's just ready to become a beekeeper. And this was her later in the year with her top bar hive, just like establishing this rapport with her bees, getting this relationship with nature that we really don't have anywhere else in any human activity. It's like we don't have the same kind of intimate relationship with the natural world. There's nothing really else in the insect world where we have such a connection as we do with bees. And of course I like to say bees are a gateway bug. Once you start realizing that these honeybees are important, you realize that there's over 20,000 species of other kinds of bees, and you realize that all kinds of bugs are important, and you realize that like all these plants are blooming, all these trees are blooming that you never realized before. It changes your relationship with the world. And this is something that even if you're not a beekeeper, or if you have just 1 hive, 2 hive, it doesn't matter. This is a relationship that we can propagate with the next generation, and it's critically important for us to do this because we're going to lose it otherwise. It's we talk about like colony collapse disorder. I've talked more about PCD, people collapse disorder, but I think what we're really dealing with is BCD, beekeeper collapse disorder, because I spent about 5-6 years working for commercial beekeepers. I started with 1,000 hives in Vermont for a season. It seemed like all my friends were moving to Brooklyn. I decided on a whim to move to Montana. I worked for a beekeeper with 5,000 hives out there. Then I worked for a beekeeper with 15,000 hives in Florida. I spent like all these years just like learning the ropes of this like industrial bee farming, and it was fascinating. I loved it. But I always knew that I was kind of different. I wasn't locked in. I wasn't trying to support a family or make like a real set income. And I saw a lot of potential for difference, a lot of change, and I knew there was a lot of different ways of keeping bees. And I also knew that bees could thrive if left to their own devices. But we've got bees and people, people and bees. This idea of beekeeper collapse disorder is that these commercial beekeepers, they're some of the most miserable people that you're gonna meet anywhere. And they all love what they do. They love their bees. And I really think that they don't want to have to put chemicals or antibiotics into beehives or feed them all this artificial stuff, but they feel locked in. They're on the wagon now and they can't get off because they've got payroll to meet. They've got growers that are supporting them, you know? The U.S. is like a net food importer. We're not even feeding ourselves as a country. But what food we are growing is getting supported by these migratory pollinators who are really keeping the system of farming going. And of course it's crucially dependent on these migratory pollinators, the way that they're doing it. You know, in row farming monocultures, growing food in a bell jar, they need the pollinators carted in during bloom, and then those bees are carted back out before they start to starve. There's nothing else growing. It's just miles of one kind of plant, like almond trees, or blueberries, or apples. So the bees are just moved all around to support this like system of farming that's really just poisoning and malnourishing them. You add the stress of being on the road, it's really no secret why bees are dying. But I really felt bad for these commercial beekeepers being locked into and they were the hardest working, most innovative people that I had ever met. I had never worked so hard as when I just first started. But I also realized that there were hives like this, like living in the wild, that would survive year after year with no kinds of treatments, no kinds of supplemental feeding, and not only were they surviving, but they were also swarming. They were propagating and copying themselves and sending out babies into the woods like every year. And so where was the difference, you know, between the managed population and these wild bees? This was over in Dutchess County, not too far from here, over at the KOA in Kopek. And according to the owners, this hive had been here, the same hive, for 20 years. Ever since they bought the property, they had to knock this house down, the bees had to go, and this thing was 9 feet tall. As I started removing it, there was almost 200 pounds of honey in this hive. The bees were like super sweet and gentle. These are like the bees of my dreams. I was humble in front of this beehive. I found the queen early on. I marked her. I had her for 2 years. After doing this removal, I raised hundreds of daughter queens from this hive, and they were phenomenal. But how come these were so good, whereas the commercial bees were just like struggling? And well, these beekeepers, like, I knew that this would not be sustainable. You wake up in the morning, you have to feed your bees, you have to medicate your bees, you have to move your bees thousands of miles in order to make ends meet and support your family. How long is this going to go on? And with bees like dying more and more, they're breeding genetics of bees that are growing all the time, so they can constantly make splits, replace their dying hives. And of course these bees are turning all their food into more brood, into more babies. And when that food isn't there in the environment, they have to do supplemental feeding. And since they're raising brood all the time, they're also raising parasites all the time, so they need treatment. These bees really can't survive on their own anymore. And this is where the money is in the beekeeping industry. So, and these are the guys that are supplying bees to hobbyists these days. It's totally a different situation from having a couple hives in your backyard that you want to keep alive with minimal inputs. It's a completely different world. So, you know, they're basically like welfare bees. These bees have been like, they're not like the wild creature, resilient creatures that they once were. Though I still think that that is there under the surface with a bit of rehabilitation, you know. So even when these bees are healthy, when treatments are there in time and everything's fed and well nourished and things are all going right, you have things like this, you know. This is when it finally started to rain in California. You can't even get the forklift off the truck to move the bees off. Or this was in Texas 2 years ago when it started to rain, and these bees were actually were alive, but it ended up being a total loss. You can see them trying to bubble out of the box. So we have unpredictable weather patterns these days. When I first started 16 years ago, you saw the first swarms in the first week of May. You got your honey supers on by the third week of May. You're making your first harvest by the start of July. And everything kind of had a time frame and ran like clockwork and was repeating year after year. And these years, all the beekeepers are just on their toes because there's no normal anymore in global weirding. So it's, I mean, last year there was still snow on the ground at this time of year. It was like treacherous, but you know, so we're all just taking it one day at a time and trying to figure out what's going on. And meanwhile, the bees are just like, don't know what to do with us humans anymore. They'd much prefer if we left them alone, I think. So it's easy to talk about all this doom and gloom and all the problems in this industry, how it's affecting commercial beekeepers and how that trickles down to the people who are buying bees from them. And this is not the end-all of what's going on. Varroa is not like the nail in the coffin, and maybe it'll be this next mite. That's a Varroa mite on the left. That one on the right is called Tropailelops. That is a mite that is naturally hosted by Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee that's in Southeast Asia. Varroa mite jumped from an Asian species, Apis cerana, and when bees finally made it to Eastern Asia, Russia, and Eastern China, the Varroa mite jumped from cerana onto our bees, mellifera, and then spread around the world over the course of a century, and eventually got here in the 80s. That same process is now happening with this other mite. It has jumped from dorsata, the giant honeybee, onto mellifera. And they found it in a couple countries in Africa now, and it's only a matter of time before this thing gets to the States and starts affecting our bees. They say it's like Varroa on steroids. And what's going to happen when that gets here? Is that going to wipe out southern beekeeping? Is it going to put up statewide quarantines? People won't be able to buy packages anymore? Or the package price will triple, quadruple? We don't even know what's going to happen. But this is like the forefront of like Sammy Ramsey's research, like looking at this Asian mite and seeing what we can do to prepare for something like that. So this is all fear-inducing, you know. You go to a bee meeting and it's all talked about mites, 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 and now the new mite. Makes me wonder if dog lovers go to dog conventions and spend the whole time talking about fleas. So Anyway, I knew that bees had some natural resistance. They had their own tricks. Otherwise, they wouldn't be around for, we figure, about 70 million years. Bees have been in their current form, I think, for about 30 million years. I think they have the ability to solve problems. So, it's like I was like going around the country, like learning beekeeping. I learned to raise queens. When a former boss of mine, I was out west doing almond pollination, learning industrial beekeeping, when my first boss in Vermont called me and said his bees were crashing. He was down to 500 of his normal 1,000 hives, and he picked up what he had left by hand, shipped them down to South Carolina, begged me to come back and just do whatever I could to save his bees and save his bee business. And he said goodbye, said good luck. He mentioned he stressed the fact that I was going to be all alone. And it was the spring of 2005, and I started going through his hives, and I had to call him right away and tell him another half of the bees had died. He had barely had like 200 some hives left out of the 1,000 that he normally ran. He had a Coumaphos strip in every hive, a product called Checkmite. That's a neurotoxin, really nasty stuff. I pulled up one of these Checkmite strips, and there were varroa mites crawling up and down on the strip that was meant to kill them. And it was a real eye-opening experience. I mean, I was looking around, I was 24 years old, I was responsible for millions of little lives, and I really had no idea what I was doing. And I explained all this to the boss, and how like the bees were just going backwards, the ground was literally crawling with shriveled winged bees. And the next day, 12 liters of formic acid showed up on my doorstep. This is before Mite Away, before formic was a legal treatment in this country. I had to get the butcher pads, hold my breath as I just laid them on tops dip these pads in the acid and lay them on the tops of the beehives. And that sticky paper I put under the hives I took out the next day, and there were rows of varroa mites that had been killed by that acid. That acid also killed all of the young brood, it killed a bunch of the young bees, and also killed a good quarter of the queens that I treated those hives with. And even today, that Mite Away stuff, using formic at the right dosage will affect your hives in that way. But it will kill mites, and if you're that desperate, it is like an option, you know? And for me, like, I don't care if you treat your bees or not. Like Solomon mentioned, like a century from now, or in the course of evolution, this little sliver of time does not matter. Everyone takes themselves very seriously in this industry, but whether you treat or not, I run Anarchy Apiaries. I don't make rules for other beekeepers. Everyone has to do what they think they gotta do, and there is no right or wrong or good or evil in my world. But the way that I make my decisions and how I guide my beekeeping is that I see monotony and I see diversity. And I know that bees thrive on diversity. It's what they're the catalyst for, and their whole evolution has just created diversity in the entire world. So I love diversity among beekeepers, among people, among different designs of hives and things like that, and like different management styles. I think everyone like has a place and has a say, and there's no right or wrong to it. But so when I was like talking to the boss and doing this formic acid treatment on those hives, he said you can just make walkaway splits. We want to get the operation back up to 1,000 hives. Take a strong hive, split it in half. Whatever side is queenless will raise a new queen. Well, we didn't really have any hives that were strong enough to do that to. They had been knocked back by the varroa mite infestation and then knocked back by the varroa mite treatment, but they weren't at that swarming, splitting state yet. So what I did in spring of 2005 was hook up with a couple local beekeepers. I did some quick reading, and I taught myself how to graft. Grafting is the process of taking a tiny tool, such as this Chinese push-button grafting tool, picking up a larva. You can't use an egg because eggs are too fragile. They're glued to the bottom of the cell. But you get a larva that's as small as possible, pick it up, put it into a queen cup like this, and then you can put 30 or 40 or 50 of these cups into a very strong queenless hive. So you can take a very strong hive, and I could do a walkaway split it in two, and then the queenless side will raise a queen. You'll get one new queen. Or I can take that strong hive, I can remove all the eggs, remove the larva, stress them out for a couple years. This is invasive, manipulative beekeeping processes that we're talking about. But then within a couple hours, I will put in a graft of, say, 50 of these little cups. 10 days after I do this graft, I will take each of these queen cells that they'll draw from these cups, disperse them into 50 little starter hives and hook up 50 new beekeepers, or I have 50 queens going from this one hive. So it's all about the numbers of this grafting process. So I'll pass this around. You can see a grafting tool and the queen cup along with it. The problem was, when I was there in South Carolina, I didn't have that handy dandy push button grafting tool that costs all of $2.99 at any bee supply place. But I had a paper clip, and I flattened down the end of the edge of the paper clip, and I taught myself how to do it that way, and I was doing everything wrong. It was a tough go. I was rolling the larva out of the cell, and that was just mashing it up. I was using sunlight to light the larva to see what I was doing, and the UV was just frying them. It was a really steep learning curve, and really it didn't go so well until the tupelo trees bloomed in South Carolina. Devin, you know all about the tupelo bloom down there. It's like there's like these trees just like in the swamps just bloom, and they weren't logged because they're in the swamps. So you have these old school trees with this huge honey flow. That's why so many beekeepers go down to that area. And so once those trees bloomed, that honey flow was so forgiving for me learning this new method, not really knowing what I was doing. And suddenly the queen cells started working, and I would put them into splits I made, and they started getting mated and laying eggs. I was amazed that it actually worked. Then the splits ran out of room, so I had to split the splits, and I started running out of equipment, and I spent every night just like building frames all night, putting in foundation just to use them all up the next day, and I did it day after day, grafting every day, until I looked around and looked at the calendar. I realized it was the start of May, and I had the operation back up to 1,000 hives. That's like the magic of grafting. We'll talk a bit about grafting versus other methods like this weekend and stuff, but grafting definitely gets you the numbers, and that's what I learned in the spring. I was totally hooked, and we picked those up at the start of May, and we brought them up to St. Lawrence County, New York, and up in northern Vermont, put them on the dandelion flow, these 1,000 new hives with young queens in them. And 2005 was a bumper year. They went off and made a huge honey crop. It paid off this whole rescue mission I had done. The boss said I had done such a good job that, and since I wasn't getting paid very much anyway, he said, take 10 hives, take 10 of whatever you want. These will be your bees. Find yourself a bee yard. We appreciate what you did to help out. So I went through all these 1,000 hives, and I already had some selected in my mind. I picked 10 hives that weren't showing the shriveled wings, or the spotty brood, or as much of a varroa infestation as the rest of the operation. And they became the base of the genetic stock that I'm still working with today. And that spring in 2005 was the last time any of my bees were treated. I say I treat them nice. So, but that goes hand in hand with me propagating this stock, learning how to raise queens, and at the same time that I went treatment free. So, well, that's my background in a nutshell. I went back out west to work for commercial beekeepers doing pollination to make enough money for a season that I could start my own operation. Pretty much just buy me some time to figure out my methods, how I wanted to keep bees, and where I wanted to set up, and how I wanted to run a queen breeding operation, because I knew that that's what I wanted to do, now that I had the skill set. So I ended up working with a Florida beekeeper as a queen raiser down there. He ran a 4,000 hive operation. I just raised queens for that operation, lived in the mating yard, and I had 5 of my own hives down there in Florida. I was able to split those 5 hives into 160 little 3-frame nukes. I took a Langstroth 10-frame deep, I put 2 dividers in it, like a queen castle type thing, and 3 framers in that lang. So 160 sounds like a whole lot of bees, but it was really only like 50-some deep boxes. It was like a pickup truck load. But I had raised the queens from them, and that's, again, the power of grafting. I went from 5 hives up to 160 in less than 2 months. All from just like that accelerated artificial queen rearing process. So I got registered, I got trip permits, I made some calls here in the Hudson Valley. Some of my old college buddies, a couple of my friends had bought farms. It was where the local food movement was happening, and all these little organic farms were sprouting up. This was about 12 years ago. I moved on back up to this area, put up some signs at the health food stores, and suddenly I had 15 bee yards from scratch. And people I could give a little bit of honey to. Some people just wanted a little bit of pollination for their fruit trees, or some people just wanted to be part of something going on. It was a really great time, because suddenly, like the year before, colony collapse disorder had hit the media. Everybody wanted to help the bees out and the beekeepers, so it was a good time to roll back on up here and set things up, put them on the dandelion flow, these 160 Langstroth nukes. I sat down, and these bees were super clean. They were from this survivor stock that I had. I had broken the brood cycle in these hives, and I'm going to spend probably the rest of the weekend talking about what breaking the brood cycle does to the hive in terms of knocking down varroa and also increasing the bees' nutrition, their protein uptake by like a resting time where they're not actually actively feeding larvae. I'll go into that in more detail, but so I'd broken the brood cycle. They were from this survivor stock, and I sat back, I got them all off of any plastic. They were all on foundationless comb at this point. A little bit of small cell, a little bit of foundationless. I got my own opinions about small cell too, you know. But and I watched as these bees started to bubble out the fronts of the entrances and started to grow in population, and then they started to swarm out of these little nuke boxes, and I looked around and I didn't have another frame or another box or anything to put these growing hives into. I'd burned through all my commercial beekeeping job money by then. I was broke, and I really had no choice but to come up with some sort of alternative rather than buying 160 Langstroth setups. That would put me in debt for $30,000 or so. You know how expensive it is to buy Langstroth equipment. And I wasn't like into it. The square wooden boxes, built them like for years at that point. So I really stumbled onto the mission of Anarchy Apiaries. It's to bring the means of production back to the beekeeper. To make beekeeping a lot simpler, a lot more affordable, a lot more approachable and less complicated than it's been for the last 160, 170 years. You go back before Lorenzo Langstroth patented the movable frame hive. Before 1851, everybody kept bees. But there wasn't really a beekeeping industry. Honey was rarely bought or sold, if ever, but everyone had a little bit of honey because everyone had bees. You talk to folks, everyone's grandparents, great-grandparents had bees on the farm. You had dogs, cats, and bees. You know, there were bees on every farm, church, school, there were bees everywhere. You know, and everyone made their own hives from some straw or hollowing out a log, something what you had around. And this was sustainable beekeeping that went on for thousands of years, really. Until the Industrial Revolution came around, Langstroth made this incredible discovery of bee space and how to make a frame that honored that bee space so you could take apart the hive and put it back together. Within a couple decades, people had built a centrifuge and they were spinning the wax comb and putting that comb back on the hive. So now rather than killing off your skep with sulfur to get the honey, now you could take the hive apart, just take the honeycombs out, and give that wax comb after it's empty back to the bees. Rather than the hive making new wax all the time, they could reuse the wax and use all those resources now just to make surplus honey. And instantly the commercial bee world was born. These huge honey crops were suddenly possible. And it went great. You know, I still have Langstroth hives. I do spin the comb in an extractor. It went great in the 1800s until around the 1880s when one very serious contagious disease started spreading, first from hive to hive and then from bee yard to bee yard. That disease is American foul brood, AFB, a highly contagious spore-forming bacteria that can't be killed. It can be irradiated or burned, pretty much, and it's still the most serious bee disease. And so it started wiping out whole apiaries. Hives would crash, and then other hives would rob out that hive, bring the spores back, and then they would crash. And I've known beekeepers who couldn't get it under control and have gone out of business because of American foul brood. So, in light of this terrible disease, the industry put stress on every state government to ban hives that couldn't be inspected. Hives that, like a skep, even though this is the public image still of a beehive, this is an illegal beehive in most states. Or a hollow log is not something that can actually be legally kept. It has to be taken apart, inspected in the brood for American foul brood, and then put back together. It's why we have a registration program. It's why we have state bee inspectors. And they do a good service by keeping this disease from spreading to the neighbors, and whole bee communities could be at risk if not for them. But what it did in the industry is that now, to be legal, you needed a hive that could be taken apart and put back together. And the only model that they were presented with was the Langstroth hive. And a couple generations went by, everyone adopted this monopoly of the Langstroth hive, and beekeeping went from this common thing that everyone did to what it is today. It's an esoteric lost art. Even in the recent Renaissance in the past 10 years, it's still a fraction of a percent of our population are beekeepers. We had this like century-long gap of this, we lost the connection to our bees, and thus the connection to the environment. And now we're bringing it back, even though it's still a very, very expensive hobby. So, back into a bit of my story, I had these 160 hives that were starting to swarm. I needed to build boxes for them, and I knew skeps were illegal, even though I do love skeps. And I had kept a couple skeps in Hawaii where we don't have fixed comb laws, in a couple different states, and they're really awesome. But I started making Kenyan top bar hives because it was the only thing that I could really find that was a legally inspectable hive that was that simple to build. It's basically a trough, and I'll talk a little bit more about alternative hives through the days, but it's a trough that you lay sticks on. This is a hive that had flipped over and I righted it back up, but very easy to build on a table saw. And people make them out of barrels, they make them out of like whatever you could, and you know, I can go to the sawmill and for about $5 worth of lumber I could build this horizontal hive. And like really, like these days if you show me a dumpster, I can build you a couple beehives out of the contents for sure. And I started like building lots of these things, and I started putting Russian bees into them, and they did actually survive very well for me in New York, but it takes the right kind of bees. Top bars and horizontal hives have gotten a bad rap of not being able to winter well, but that's mostly because people are putting Georgia bees in them that tend to die no matter what kind of box you put them into. But I found that with Russian bees that are able to move around, that aren't as affected by the cold, they actually thrive. And I had these up in the Adirondacks, and I had top bar hives go through 38 below zero and come through just fine, like that. The problem was using that specific stock of bees is that they swarm a lot, and I had over 300 top bar hives at one point, and if you're not there to expand that brood nest, if they hit a wall of honey in a horizontal hive, they'll feel congested and honey bound and they'll swarm. Even if they have empty room, like towards the back of the hive. Actually, I'll pause here and do a magic trick. Alright, I'm going to make a top bar hive appear out of nowhere. Right here. Well, it's basically nowhere. This is a baby blue one. I have baby pink ones as well.
It's a boy or girl?
There you go. It's a drone. And so, feel free to come check this out. But then just the sticks lay on top of this trough, just like so. And I was like doing a middle divider in these. So I had two little 4-comb nukes, and I was raising queens in them, things like that. But once you put them into a bigger hive, they could have empty room towards the back, but if there's a wall of honey, they'll feel congested and they'll swarm. You have to drop one of these empty top bars towards the middle constantly, about every 10 days or something, especially like right now during our swarm season. And at 300 some of these hives, I was just not there to do that. I was just like, I didn't have the time, and I had whole yards that swarmed before I even got around to it. And I like it when bees swarm, you know. It's like, for me, it's not being a bad beekeeper or a negligent beekeeper. For me, it's a sign of their vitality, a sign of their success, you know. We're never going to breed it out of them. So, yeah, I'd rather have bees that swarm than no bees at all. But I realized that there were probably some other methods or some other hive designs that I wanted to look into that I could not have so much constant management. But while I was like working with the top bar hives, I started like looking at some different methodologies because, you know, I come from a commercial beekeeping background, but I've started selling bees. That I was making nukes out of top bar hives in a real commercial fashion using like mated caged queens that I had raised. But I realized that these bees were swarming so much, and that's like they were making such nice swarm cells that I just wanted them to keep. So I was selling nukes in top bar hives. I was taking 5 or 6 combs out, and then the hive would have to remake those 5 or 6 combs. And then when I harvested honey, I was mashing and straining, taking a whole comb of honey, brushing the bees off, cutting it into a bucket, and this was my extractor, a stick. But then that was also taking away my combs, and I was looking around and I had no extra combs at any time. And being a top bar beekeeper, I really knew the value of drawn comb because I didn't have any. So rather than selling nukes, I started shaking packages out of my hive, and I made a little package funnel out of cardboard and duct tape. It really fit in with the aesthetics of my operation. And I started simulating bee biology. I would have a hive that overwintered. I see they were making lots of queen cups, lots of drones, backfilling the brood nest, gearing up to swarm. So I would just simulate the swarm. I would aid in the decision that the bees had already made themselves. and I would use the swarm cells. I would let them keep finishing it, and it was much more like what the hive would do on its own, way closer to bee biology rather than taking 5 combs out and cutting up the whole body of the hive. And it seemed that they recovered faster by not having to redraw that wax, and it seemed like a lot less management, a lot closer to the way that bees did things. So I started thinking, it's like, am I just like a natural beekeeper? Am I following bee biology? Is this a bee sanctuary that I'm just mimicking their natural reproduction rates? But I was still grafting. I was grafting into top bar hives. I use popsicle sticks glued into this groove here, and if I just leave the groove empty, I can push those little queen cups into a top bar and graft into it. And so am I a commercial queen breeder? Is this a bee sanctuary? I don't know, somewhere in between. Oh, how big do I want to be? Where is this gonna go? You know, so looking into how big you can push your limits. This is the Kona queen operation. They're the largest queen producers in the world. At least they were about 10 years ago when I visited them. And I was fascinated. This is just some of their cell raising hives where they're raising and grafting into. Solomon.
What's that pipe downstairs?
Exactly. Alright, so what we got here in Kona is that they have a double nuke system. So there's a laying queen in this, it's a double stacked nuke box, and there's a laying queen on this side, a double stacked nuke box. There's a queen excluder right here that spans both of the nukes, and a single box on top of that. And there's a pipe that goes down every one of these rows. This pipe hooks up to a giant mechanical bellows that blows smoke down the length of this pipe with offshoots underneath each one of these nukes. That smoke blows from underneath and runs the young nurse bees up through the excluder into this top box here. And once they have enough bees, young bees, in that top box, they put a slide in. It's called a cloak board, named after a New Zealand beekeeper, a queen raiser named Harry Cloak. And it's convenient his name is Cloak because it also cloaks the queens from down below. So they put a slide in here and make that top box queenless. And then they put that graft in. They transfer the larva into the cups and do their graft. And then 5 days later, those queen cells are capped, they're moved out to an incubator, and the process is done again. And this is how you raise 300,000 queens in a year. I was amazed by this. I was amazed that the innovation of beekeepers just blows my mind constantly. I can do that. It's way bigger than I was ever gonna be, but I was just super fascinated by what they could possibly do. And this is really like how you want your cell raisers to be. You want them to be bubbling out with bees. This is one of Michael Palmer's cell raisers up in northern Vermont, where he's raising a lot of queens very quickly in a very short season, all for winter hardiness and honey production. These are some of Troy Hall's queen cells. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. I think Troy uses a queen right starter finisher the way that you do, Solomon. And I'll talk a little bit more about queen raising methods and things like that. But these are very nice queen cells. You want to make sure that they're large, that they look well fed. You want to see some residual royal jelly in the queen cup. You want to make sure that larva did not run out of food before she pupated. It's just a sign that your cell raiser was well fed. And with the right conditions of bubbling out bees, you're mimicking swarming conditions. And these queen cells can really be good as swarm cells, and everything is just right. So I was messing around with lots of different cell raising methods because I had this ability to graft and I had some bee power to work with, and I was raising lots of cells, so I needed like a little tiny hive to get the cell going, that the virgin queen could emerge from the cell in, and then a week later she goes on a mating flight, mates with 20 or 30 or so drones, comes back, starts laying eggs, and then you can repeat the process. So me still not wanting to spend any money on like you can get these little tiny ones, like from Man Lake, right here. They're a little expensive, but they're they're just made out of one-piece styrofoam. They have a little feeder compartment right here, and these little tiny baby frames, like so. So I was thinking of these when I decided to make a similar type of structure out of flower pots. I used 6-inch terracotta pots, and I put little tiny top bars on them, and they actually worked. The bees drew combs on these little baby top bars, and they were cute as can be. But then I started reading that it's better to let the queen lay for a couple weeks before you catch her. If you're catching about 21 days, about 3 weeks after cell placement, then it's shown that her ovarials are better developed. She's a longer-lived queen. Seems to be a better quality queen overall if you're not catching them as soon as they start to lay eggs. these little flower pots were way too small to let them go that extra week, so I ended up eating them all. And I got the bees out of them first, but I was trying to come up with some other methods to really have a little bit more room and something that I could build simply and easily manage. So I came up with the basic hive structure that I'm working with today. This is my evil twin who wears a tie. This isn't me. But this is one of the hives that I based, I was at the same time having a lot of top bar hive swarm, looking at alternative models or hive designs, and I was sent the translation of Emile Warre's book. Warre, W-A-R-R-E, he was a French beekeeper and wrote a book called Beekeeping for All in the 1940s. It's a free download, you can find it at biobees.com, and it's a beautiful book. It's a great philosophy. His whole idea is leave the bees alone, let bees be bees, they know what's best. He designed hundreds of different, he looked at hundreds of different designs of hives until he decided on what he called the people's hive. Generally people call them a Warre hive, and he would only go twice a year. He would come in the spring, pick up the whole hive, and put an empty box underneath. Then in the fall he would come, and he used a wire, and he sliced off that top box, and he harvested the honey that way. He kept his entrance down low towards the bottom of the hive, and no matter what kind of hive you do, whether it's vertical or horizontal, the bees tend to keep their brood nest close to the entrance. That's where they can ventilate it the best, and they keep their honey furthest from the entrance. That's where they can guard it the best. So you think on a Langstroth hive or a Warre hive, the brood nest is down low by the entrance, and the honey is up top. In a horizontal top bar hive or the Zuten hive, you have your entrance on one side. That tends to be where the brood is, and if you want to harvest the honey, you go in from the other side, the far side, like that. And so in the Warre hive, with the entrance down low, they were constantly moving their brood nest down. It was like an eternal hollow tree. And he never opened it except to harvest or to expand from down below. And he let the bees swarm, let them supersede. He said that, like, just leave the bees alone, because they're bees. They've been around, like I say, for 70 million years or so. The problem is, today's world is not the same as 1940s France. We have, changing climates. We've got pesticide exposure. Often the bees don't get enough food in a single season that they can survive, let alone varroa pressure and all the viruses that they're getting inoculated with from the varroa mites constantly. Let alone all those problems and pests. My idea of a future of beekeeping is backyard, grow your own propagation. I want you all to be able to make splits from your best survivors, and every one of you can be a breeder on any scale, even with just one hive splitting it into two. But this is really the only sustainable beekeeping future, because once the Trops mite gets here, or whatever other problem, if state lines are quarantined, or if you just can't get bees, or the package price goes up to $300 next year, which maybe it will, the way it's going, we're way, way better off working with your own survivors, the bees that you like, and splitting your hives. That could be as simple as waiting around, letting your hive swarm and being there to catch the swarm, but you can simulate that process. You can be any kind of beekeeper you want to be. And like I said, I don't care if you treat your bees or don't treat your bees. Your management is your own thing. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but what I am interested in hearing is whether you buy bees every year or whether you grow bees every year. If you're good enough at growing bees, at working with your survivors, if you know how to recuperate from loss, it can be catching swarms, it can be making splits, opening up your hives and doing manipulations, grafting, it could be any of these things. If you're good enough at recuperating from loss, then you can start thinking about weaning them off of treatments, or weaning them off of artificial feed, or all these crutches that the industry is quickly becoming dependent on. Bees are very quickly going the route of cows or other livestock, animals that are totally dependent on antibiotics or supplemental feed or treatments. Whereas I think bees are really resilient. They haven't been messed with like other parts of agriculture until relatively recently, just the last century or so. They still have this wildness, the resilience to stand all by their lonesome, but they're quickly losing that ability from commercial beekeepers, who aren't the enemy, but it's just that they're doing everything they can to try to keep their bees alive, whereas the bees are getting weaker and weaker and the pests are getting stronger. Varroa mites now are worse than ever. They've been in this country for decades, and we're just now starting to even learn about how they feed on the bees, and how the diseases are getting worse all the time. Whereas most researchers, academics agree that if we never treated, yes, there would be a giant genetic bottleneck countrywide, but then re-diversification, and we'd be over the Varroa problem by now. If we had just worked with survivors. Of course, that's it means your wallet gets lighter, and it's not good by a commercial standpoint, but these days, I mean, beekeepers who even do treat are having lots and lots of losses, and we're seeing a real shift towards the treatment-free approach. If you're not treating for Varroa, we used to be like the enemy. We used to be the mad mite bombers, causing everyone else's hives to die. But now I find in clubs that I go to, people are a lot more open, because even people who do treat are having a lot of losses. And it's not just from Varroa, because they're monitoring before they treat and then remonitoring after they treat to make sure their treatments work. But still, these guys aren't having a lot of success, and they're open to any kind of ideas. So I'm always coming up with ideas, because this is fun for me. I mean, my beekeeping is more like one giant art project. So I came up with this hive design, and the problem with the Warre hive is that I don't agree that people should just throw commercial bees in their backyard and leave them alone, because they are going to crash. Those mites are going to spread to other hives, spread diseases, and spread diseases to wild bees living in trees in your neighborhood too. It could be really, really detrimental if you're not monitoring for if your hive is going to collapse or not. So I'm a big proponent of growing your own bees, and I always wanted to make my own stuff because it kept my costs down initially. And so I changed the dimensions of the Warre hive to make it a little bit easier to inspect. I made them only 6 inches deep, like so. I get rough cut lumber, that's 1 by 6. And I changed the whole philosophy. I actually go into the hives and I do split them and monitor them, equalize them, and run them as part of my queen rearing operation. So people have told me, since I've changed the dimensions and changed the whole methodology, that you should stop calling them Warre hives and just call them comfort hives. Well, I'm not quite over the pretentiousness yet of calling them comfort hives. I still call them box hives, but it's its own unique thing that I can build really, really simply. And I was cutting these top bars on a table saw until I discovered this, which is the forefront of beekeeping technology. It's a barbecue skewer. So I cut this down to 11 inches, and I staple in a really simple bar rest here, and the bees draw their combs off of these barbecue skewers, just like so. And they stay pretty straight on them, just like that. And they're just cute as can be. We're big on cuteness around here. So once I discovered this, I realized I could build the whole hive without using a table saw at all. And I still have all my fingers, and I'm very proud of that. But it's a very simple hive to build that just about anyone can do. So I started making lots of these things.
What's your bar rest on? Do you rip it?
I find scrap, or sometimes I do actually rip this little piece right here. I don't route out the edge like that. That's way too labor intensive, over-engineered for me. But anything you can find to staple into this side box as a little bar rest, like that. Yep, and there's as long as they're 6 inches deep, there's really relatively very little side attachments and things like that. And I have a jig on my chop saw, so I can just chop all these boards away. And so I started making a whole lot of these very quickly, and I worked up to about 1,500 or so this spring. I've been somewhere between 500 to 1,000 mating nukes the last couple years. Got up to 1,500 this year. This is one of my mating yards in the south. It's next to a beer dispensary. You can see the Budweiser truck right there. I think the fumes from the beer help ensure proper mating of the queen bees. So I'm going to go into some of the details of how I'm raising queens, how I've been raising queens the last couple years in my operation, and then I'll tell you all to do something totally different like that. But basically, I run 3 sets in my mating yard. So this is a set of mating nukes here, a set there, and I have about 200 little nukes in a set. And when I say a little baby nuke, I'm taking this hive. It holds 8 combs side to side, but I have this center divider in here. This divider is just a piece of sheet tin or so. You slide it out. This is a toddler size, so I can slide it back in and make a baby size like so. So it's 2 little 4-comb nukes next to each other. They share heat. Got an entrance here, an entrance there, a screen bottom so they're easy to plug and move, and they don't get too hot like that. Like Solomon, I don't think screen bombs do anything for varroa control at all. It's just an easy way for me to move bees, and it's so these little babies don't get too hot in like the Florida heat here. So about 200 of these or so a week. I'll go through this set, then that set, then that set. And my process is I'll go in and I'll find all the queens in this nuke and I'll put them into little cages, like so. I'll pass that one around for you. So I'll find the queen, and I know it's going to be 3 weeks that will go by before I get back there. I'll find the queen the next day. I'll drop in a grafted queen cell that's ripe. She's going to emerge in another day or 2, like that. So by the time 3 weeks go by and I'm into this first set, that new queen ought to be mated, laying eggs, and she should have been laying eggs for a while, long enough, at least a week or so, that she'll have her own capped brood in there. That way I know that she's like mated okay, and she's not just laying drones. It ought to be worker brood in there. And since this little nuke is so small, it's just about the perfect size to go for 3 weeks. I drop in that queen cell, I'm back into here in 3 weeks. So you can imagine if I'm working 200 nukes every week with 100% mating, I'm getting 200 mated queens a week, and I'm getting 200 little combs of brood because I have to cut these nukes back every week. And so you can imagine the constant equipment crisis that I'm in. It's so much brood all the time. So I started developing a system to use that brood for the cell raising process, and also that's how I make my splits. So I don't even need to have outyards to make splits and recuperate losses. I'm getting so much brood just from my mating nukes in this system that I save some of the queens and some of the brood every week, and that goes to replenish losses in outyards. And every week I go to the post office with a whole bunch of these buzzing envelopes, and I ship queens like anywhere in the country. The postal employees think it's weird. I think it's weird. But I bring them jars of honey, and the queens tend to get there on time. And it goes pretty well. So this brood, this is me and one of my helpers, Tucka. We sit on these little red wagons here, and we go through these little nukes, just like harvesting the queens that are mated and the brood. And the brood looks like this every week. This is part of breaking the brood cycle. You know, when I worked in some commercial queen rearing operations, I was taking care of like sometimes 900 or 1,000 little nukes at a time, and their brood always tended to look like this, and those nukes never needed to be treated. Even though these commercial guys, they were just using standard Italian bees. There's no special survivor stock. They were on plastic foundation, no like special small cell magic or anything like that, but the nukes never needed to be treated. And I was wondering, like, how not? Like, I've seen so many varroa losses, but I realized what I was doing in these nukes was breaking the brood cycle. Every 3 weeks I would go in, I would steal the queen, replace it with a queen cell. That virgin queen runs around in there for about a week, no eggs are being laid. And then she starts laying eggs, and 2 weeks later I'm back in there again to catch her. So every month those nukes were getting a break in the brood cycle. 90% of the mites are always in the brood. If they're emerging on the adult bees, the first thing that they want to do is jump onto an open larva and hide. Because bees have a grooming behavior, they have a biting behavior. They're able to cull the mites and clean themselves up if they're able to get to the mites. Usually they're not, because the mites jump right into open larvae. That break in the brood cycle enables the bees to clean themselves up. And it clicked for me years ago, working for other guys, that this is what bees do when they swarm. The old queen leaves with half the bees, and you have almost 3 weeks of no eggs being laid. The hive is totally broodless by the time that new queen is laying eggs. And so all the mites are crawling around, the bees are cleaning them up. And I realized it's not only knocking down varroa mites, this brood break. You have a week, if you're using ripe queen cells, you have a week where the bees don't have to produce royal jelly. You have no open larvae for a period of a week in there. And so the bees' hypopharyngeal glands, the glands that make the jelly, are swelling, and they're storing up their protein and sugars in their bodies in anticipation of new brood that'll be fed with the new queen when she gets going. And so there's a lot of important things in that royal jelly. One of them is vitellogenin. It's an incredibly essential protein to make healthy bees. And so by this break in the brood cycle, not only does it knock down parasites and mites, one thing, the bees are able to scrub all their cells and polish everything before the new queen gets going, but they also swell their hypopharyngeals, and it's basically like super brood from the new queen, like that. So we get hundreds of these combs every week, and they're so valuable and they're so well nourished. The bees that emerge from this brood are really well nourished bees ready to feed the next generation once they become nurse bees. So this is the brood that I started taking and putting into my cell raisers, like that. So I designed a self-contained system rather than going to my outyards, getting strong hives, like taking my strongest hive and making it into a cell raiser to do a round of grafting, and then doing like it to the next strong hive the next week. You know, several weeks go by, suddenly you've destroyed all the strong hives in your operation and burnt through all your bee resources pretty quick in all your outyards. Whereas this is a self-contained system. The brood's coming from the mating nukes, going to the cell raisers weekly, like that. So I built these long cell raiser hives, and I'll graft into the same box every week. I got it down to a 4-day process that we repeat every week. On Monday, we boost this cell raiser box with brood, and we put a new graft in. On Tuesday, we catch from a set of mating nukes, and we pull out the brood and we bank it. We put that above a queen excluder for next week's cell raisers. We put it above a queen excluder because we don't want any eggs or larvae on that brood. So they'll finish capping all that brood, and then by next week it'll all be sealed, ready to go into the cell raiser again. So we don't want any rogue queen cells being made. You know what happens if they make a rogue queen cell that I don't see? She'll emerge, she'll go kill all the grafted queen cells. That's never happened to me. I always catch all the rogues. No, I'm just kidding. This is why queens are so expensive, you know. So on Monday we boost this thing with brood that's banked the week prior. We move last week's brood, last week's graft towards the back of this hive. The new brood goes in the front, and the graft goes here in a grafting frame there and a grafting frame there around a comb of bee bread, fresh pollen that they've gathered, because they need that to make royal jelly. And I've made these little tiny, super cute grafting frames to go into these cell raisers. And I generally only put like 30 to 40 in a box, like so. And they're pretty like easy to run. I just move the combs towards the back, new ones in the front, and a new graft every Monday. Every Tuesday we catch the queens, we ship them, we bank brood for the next week's graft. Wednesday we finish catching that set, and Thursday the cells go in that we grafted the previous week. So those cells are 10 days old. We graft every Monday, we put the cells in 10 days later on a Thursday. And this runs like clockwork. I do 3 rounds on all the mating nukes in Florida. It takes 9 weeks, and I do 3 rounds up here in New York. So I know what I'm doing every single day of the year. You know? And this structure, actually, like as chaotic as my life actually is, this structure enables me to experiment. It's giving me the freedom to tweak variables. I can change the feeding regimen on the cell raisers. I can try a new design on the mating nukes. Like weekly, there's always things that I can experiment with, and it's tons of fun. And I also started teaching classes that take 4 days, and I show the students like the whole system of how you can run like a small 1 or 2 person queen operation to produce several thousand queens a year. And this is as simple as I've been able to make this kind of commercial queen production structure. And so once these cell raisers really get up and running, this is what they start to look like. This is what you want. If you're raising 30 or 40 cells in a cell raiser, you want as many bees or even more bees than will fit in that box, like that. I only have 7 of these, you know, but I graft into each one of them every 7 days. That can produce thousands of queen cells. And I raise, you know, about 250 to 280 every week, and I only use the best 200 or so. So that's like the kind of the first stage of quality control in making good queens. My cell raisers, I feed real honey to, exclusively, and I feed them real pollen as well. Not pollen that I trap, pollen I buy from Arizona or the Rocky Mountains and stuff, just to supplement in addition to what they're foraging on, in addition to the best combs of bee bread, of stored pollen that I find, and the nectar that they're gathering in the good spots. So it's worked really well. This is a perfect take for 40 for 40. It's a rare thing, but it does happen. Grafting actually becomes the easiest part of this kind of like commercial queen production process. Once you get the hang of the grafting, the real art and challenge becomes setting up a proper cell raiser. And then I'm telling you how to abstract that and how to raise queens every week, week after week after week, without burning through all your resources. So with the idea of like making good, well-fed queens, that'll do well for you. Like so. That's one of this year's breeders. That's a VSH carniolan, varroa-sensitive hygiene. I'll talk a little bit more about genetics. This is my buddy Aaron Jennings of Jennings Apiaries in Louisiana. He came down and did this 4-day gauntlet with me, and he got to try his hand at grafting. His bee tattoos like rival mine. They're really, really impressive. And they loved it. He came down with his partner, and after 4 days, they me showing them as simple as this. I've been able to make this queen production system. After 4 days, he looked at me and said, "This is way too much work. We're just going to buy queens from you." But he had grafting skills. He had bee power behind him, and I was thinking, it's like, yeah, this is too much work, you know. And it's fun. It's enjoyable. It's all one big experiment or art project for me, like I said. But you know, it's so much simpler. Like in your backyard, just to find a swarm cell, put it in a box, and then you're still a queen breeder. You're still raising queens from your own survivor stock. It can be done like quite easily. It doesn't have to be so crazy. Well, raising thousands and thousands of queens, you know, I like learned beekeeping through grafting and this kind of commercial production. But I know that swarm queens are good. And so I started messing around with doing walkaway splits, a method that D. Lusby does exclusively, and also Chaz Mraz, who's a third-generation beekeeper in Vermont. He also runs 1,000-some hives and does only walkaway splits. There are many, many beekeepers who do, what you do is you make a split and you walk away for like a month, and there might be a queen. Yeah, so we got like 5 or something? Okay. So, bringing us up to speed of the experiments I'm doing now, I am still grafting and messing around with the system that I've just described to you, but I'm also doing the experiments with like how small a split I can make and how can I make a really good quality queen. I've really taught a lot of people on like, you make a small split, you have your favorite hive, your survivor hive, you can go in there and steal the queen, or make a small split with her, go back in 10 days later and they'll make several queen cells, maybe 8, maybe 10 or more, and you can distribute those queen cells to start maybe 8 hives. Well, I started getting some lab data back from David Tarpey's lab at North Carolina State University. He has what we call a queen clinic. You send him queens and he measures all the body parts and weighs them, and then he dissects the spermatheca. He'll tell you how many sperm are in the spermatheca, and then he'll tell you under a microscope, they'll stain it and tell you what percentage of those sperm are actually viable. And then they'll give the queen a grade, an A, a C-, or things like that. The problem is you don't get the queen back, you know, but it's like, I've done this for years, just so I want to make sure that my queens are quality, you know, they're going for top dollar. So I just want to make sure the methods are good, the cell raising method is good, things like that. So I started sending some of the queens, these emergency queens. These bees are made in an emergency situation. I've taken away their queen or made a small split without a queen. I even stopped calling them emergency queens because it seems to have a stigma to it. I call them bees' choice queens. So the bees get to choose the larva rather than you with that grafting tool. And this is something that anyone can do in their backyard. But those queens, from going back in 10 days later, what did you call it, a resplit, Solomon? You said it's a resplit. You split your hive, and then 10 days later you do a resplit. You go back in and resplit those whatever cells they've made each into your own little box, like a queen castle or something like that. What I found in the lab results is that those queens actually aren't that good. There's maybe 2 or 3 good ones out of a batch of maybe 10 cells or so. And so I switched that method and I stopped teaching people to do that, going back and doing the resplit. Rather, I'm just made it as simple as a recipe. I'm taking a comb of larvae, a comb of nectar, and 2 shakes of bees. I'm sealing them into this little tiny box here and moving it to another yard. And I'm doing experiments with leaving that in the same yard. You could do like 4 to 5 shakes of bees, or you can just do the same recipe, 2 shakes of bees, and confine the bees in there in a cool, dark place for about 3 days. And then they start to lose their memory after 3 days, and you can keep them in the same yard. If you leave them in the same yard without enough bees, they're mostly going to drift back. You won't have them raise good quality queens. If you do 4 or 5 shakes, they'll retain enough bees to make a good quality queen, but you want to feed them because they're losing their field force in that situation. But I've simplified enough to the recipe that the way I'm doing it, a coma larva, a coma nectar, 2 shakes, good shakes of bees into this tiny, tiny box. And they'll raise several queen cells, like so. And I'm not going back for another month, so I'm letting them fight it out. This is a virgin queen death match. Ideally, the best queen wins, you know, which in this case, well, just judging by the size of the cells, maybe that one or that one up there. So rather than dispersing those, I'm just letting the bees figure it all out by their lonesome. And here's that action in process. This is like a shot from this spring in Florida. You see this virgin queen. She emerged from this one. Actually, you see the hole where that bee is peeking in. She's already killed that one, and killed that one, and that one. And she's probably en route to kill that one and that one. You know? Oh, only one queen. So tie drama in the beehive for sure. And also, like, whatever cells are there, like the first virgin out will kill the other ones, but also the bees chew them down regularly as well. So Tarpey did a study about that, where he confined half of the queen cells under a cage so the bees couldn't chew them down, and then half of the emergency cells they could chew down, and did chew down some of them, and he weighed the queens at emergence of both sets, and he found that the cells that they could chew down but didn't, on average, were heavier queens, basically proving that bees have a conscious quality control, and they are tearing down queen cells that are an inferior weight. It's a beautiful, elegant study, and all he needed was like a wire pushing cage to do it. I was in awe of that. It was pretty amazing finding that one. So bees are actually controlling the quality of the queens when left to their own devices. I'll talk a little bit more about bait hives and Tom Celia's work through the rest of the weekend, and so I'll talk a little bit more about splitting and how I'm doing these methods, like these little tiny walk-away splits. I brought some bees to play with. I actually brought a dozen nukes of these little babies here. I think only 3 of them actually have mated laying queens in them, so we're probably going to mark them, cage them. I might use them somewhere else this week. But then I have a couple nukes that I split 10 days ago that have ripe queen cells. We might see drama out there. And I have some that I made about 2 days ago that are just starting to raise multiple queen cells. So you're going to get to see every stage of the process in the little nukes that I brought tomorrow. So it should be a lot of fun, you know. And if all else fails, you can always eat the bees. But on that note, we can go to lunch. And feel free to sit by me at lunch and pick my brain, ask me questions. I've tried a little bit of everything, so and you can too.